So, welcome to this episode of Robots in Depth. Today I'm honored to have my friend Berman here. She's from Arizona State University, and we're going to talk about, like everything in robotics. I'm so fortunate to have the opportunity to speak to you about what's going on in robotics, and I find it so fascinating. But let's start where we always start. How did you get into robotics? Why robotics? What was the first exposure to building mechanical things that could move around?
Well, I always liked building with construction sets as a child, like the Lincoln Logs and this little architecture kit. So I liked design and building back then. And then I got very interested in math and physics on the theoretical side. I went to an undergraduate program in mechanical and aerospace engineering at Princeton University. And I think that was where I first had my real exposure to robotics, because there was a professor there, Naomi Leonard, who was working on underwater gliders and how to coordinate them to take measurements efficiently about the ocean, like temperature and salinity, bioluminescence. So I worked in her lab for a few years, and I became fascinated by this idea of using natural swarms or natural groups that exhibit these collective behaviors, using that as inspiration for multi-robot control strategies.
Like emergent properties.
Emergent properties, yeah.
Very hard to control, I understand. Emergent properties are something we usually try to keep out of our systems, I understand, right?
Yeah, well, undesirable or emergent properties.
It's like herding cats, right?
Yeah, right. I think, it's such a challenge that's what I've been working on since undergraduate. I think that's where I first got exposed to robotics, was this underwater glider project.
Was it deep underwater or was it surface? We have seen these gliders that have a surface part and a kind of suspended part like 15 or 20 meters below that use the waves to move ahead. Could you explain a little bit more about those gliders?
So these were buoyancy-driven vehicles, so they move in the sawtooth pattern up and down. And they can go out taking measurements for long periods of time.
I understand that's the benefit of a glider.
Yeah.
We're talking weeks and months or even longer times, right?
Right.
Rather than maybe a day or so in a battery-powered vehicle.
Yeah.
So it's magnitudes more, right?
Yes. So you can do things like persistent monitoring of the ocean. And so I think what fascinated me about that project was the idea that you're developing these mathematical and computational tools to control groups of vehicles, not just a single vehicle, but groups of vehicles to perform some kind of desired macroscopic behavior. And the idea that you can see this in nature when you look at ant colonies or schools of fish or flocks of birds. There's no leader in the swarm, but everybody is basically every member is following local information about their neighbors, about the environment, and just through those interactions you get this very complex emergent behavior. And so I thought it was really interesting that we could possibly design those emergent behaviors by designing the controllers of the robots.
Yeah, because if the birds had a leader, that'd be just chaos. You couldn't achieve what you want to achieve with the leader. You have to design it without one.
Yeah, I think there are some strategies that do use leaders, like leader-follower strategies. But for the most part, if you want a robust system where there's not a single point of failure, then you need these decentralized strategies that are robust to disturbance and failures.
Can you talk a bit more about the development of these kind of leaderless systems?
I guess the challenge is guaranteeing that they'll do what you want them to do. And that's a major challenge that's been approached by researchers in different fields. For instance, some people use control theoretic concepts to guarantee stability. For instance, stability of a formation, that a flock will converge to a certain formation. Or there's methods that are from computer science, from the study of formal methods, to verify the correctness of behaviors using tools like linear temporal logic. So these tools come from different fields. And so one challenge right now is to kind of merge them or to create a unified framework for understanding and controlling swarm behaviors. But there's a lot of so one challenge is that sometimes it's hard to develop an accurate model of the system, because you can use, my group in particular uses models from chemical reaction networks. So modeling the individual members as molecules that are colliding and interacting with each other, and then they can switch their tasks based on their interactions. So these chemical models that abstract to differential equation models are very useful in describing the expected or the mean population dynamics. So there are fluctuations around that expected behavior based on things like the number of agents, their sensing ranges, their capabilities, and so so you also want to be able to model that variation and to hopefully produce bounds on the performance, so confidence bounds that you can be certain that the swarm will execute this behavior with this degree of confidence. And that's an open problem that we're still working on, is how do you characterize that variance? What is it a function of in terms of the robot programs and their physical capabilities? So, and then of course you have issues like they're exploring an uncertain environment. You don't know what obstacles there are in there, what features, some of them might fail, they might get stuck somewhere. So, and so these things are very difficult to model. And so we try to address that by also introducing mapping strategies where we can deploy the swarm and then get information back from them that we can use to reconstruct the environment, to modify the dynamics in our model so that it's more accurate. So that's another problem that we're addressing, because we do use these both differential equation and stochastic models to describe the robot behaviors.
And how do you say you're doing this in the air, or you're doing it underwater? How do you convince regulatory authorities that they're not going to do anything bad? Right.
No, and that's an excellent point, and that is something that's ongoing research that's being funded, for instance, by the Department of Defense, because they really want to know things like, if your adversary has a swarm and it starts interacting with your swarm, can you guarantee that your swarm is not going to go awry, or that it's not going to kill your swarm? So things like that, where you actually have interactions between different swarms as well as between a swarm and an environment. And there's two different problems, like, can you guarantee that it will go into this desired set of behaviors, or can you guarantee that it will avoid this undesirable set? And so those are two questions. They are excellent questions, and they're ones that we're trying to work on using our methods. Yeah.
Where would you say the field is in maturity? I mean, I guess you've been working on this for quite a while, and others might have worked before you. Where are the field now? Is it kind of in the beginning or in the middle, or?
So I think, I've kind of been a part of this field for a while now, at least 10 or 12 years. So I've seen it developing, and I think one thing that's been enabling the swarm technologies is the development of these really low-cost, small robot platforms that you can manufacture quickly and cheaply and then deploy in large numbers. And so there's been a whole variety of platforms, so aerial, ground, surface, underwater, that have been coming out. So that's kind of exploded recently. So that's on just the technological feasibility side, that it's actually becoming feasible to use these. But I think one of the main challenges is the control problem. So how do you control them and have them? I think the next frontier now is developing resilient autonomous collective systems. So that is that you can deploy them into an unknown environment, possibly without GPS or reliable communication, and that they can adapt to novel circumstances, so unexpected situations, that they can even learn how to deal with these different scenarios. So you have adaptation and learning, and that they can persist for long periods of time, like a single glider. But now you have a swarm of 1,000 that is robust to failures, that can adapt and learn. And that's really the next challenge. And I think it's still hard to do that, because we're not there yet in terms of broad applicability of control methods and verification methods to all kinds of circumstances. So that's still an open problem. People are working on that frontier of research. So that's why a lot of it is still confined to research labs for smaller groups. And simulations, basically, multi-agent simulations. Yeah.
So the area is kind of, maybe it's towards the end of the beginning, but it's not that far along. But it's simply that complicated, that hard. Huh?
Yeah, I think it's still, there's been so many interesting ideas, from coming from different communities, from, applied math, kinetic modeling, study of self-organization in biological systems, control theory, computer science, formal methods. There's been a lot of ideas. There's been a lot of collaborative work and discussions and workshops, and I think, and so that's been great because it's kind of been this knowledge exchange between different fields. So then the next phase of that is to combine them in these rigorous ways, in these analytically rigorous ways, and where you can't do that, develop computational techniques that can answer that question if someone says, well, I'm deploying this swarm and I want it to not, do this undesirable behavior, that you can assure them that yes, this is, ready for deployment, and we can guarantee this and that. And
because otherwise you simply won't be allowed to deploy them.
Yeah.
Right? These will be deployed then somewhere in the future in large groups, I would presume, not dozens but hundreds of thousands. Where do you see the application? I mean, say we've solved these problems, we have hardware, it's available. What would be your dream application?
So I think that there's a lot of potential in areas like environmental monitoring, humanitarian operations like search and rescue, disaster response, where you have to cover a large area, possibly manipulate things in the environment. Other applications might be for exploration. So in environments that are inaccessible to humans, like deep underwater or in outer space on other planets, doing construction and manufacturing and assembly in these environments where humans can't necessarily go
or
easily.
Don't want to go.
Exactly, yeah. There's other applications that are also new and but at a very different scale, so at the micro nano scale.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so there are people working on micro nano systems such as nanoparticles or other types of controllable systems at the micro nanoscale, controllable platforms.
That's difficult in a whole nother level.
Yes,
if you build a mechanical device as your swarm member, I'm thinking you have an easy day, because if you go to the nanoscale, everything becomes just weird, right? Yeah,
you have effects that you don't have at larger scales.
And that we have a hard time relating to them because we never experience them. We are not nanoscale entities on our own, right?
Right. And so then people are developing these kind of hybrid platforms, even with biological components like cells or bacteria, plus synthetic components, so that you can kind of exploit the propulsion or other behaviors of the biological component. Don't necessarily have to engineer that, which is really still a challenge at that scale.
So it's better to use what nature already provided.
Yeah,
right?
in some cases, So. So the applications there, at that level, there are a lot of biomedical applications. And so those include things like targeted drug delivery for cancer therapy. So getting the chemotherapy directly into tumors.
But not into the rest of the body, causing these horrible side effects.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's, I mean, of course, everybody supports that, right? Yeah, that's really interesting. So we're going from the small, I would presume that when we have so many systems, we're not going to go really big, right? Really small is one thing and medium size is one thing, but we're not going to see them sizes of buses, right? Because we want 6,000 buses flying around in the air. I think,
well then that starts getting into autonomous driverless vehicles and managing traffic. So I think that's
there's of course applications in logistics and transportation and
and I think that may be a different class of problem. Well, different constraints, obviously, because you definitely don't want collisions. Well, you don't want collisions in swarms anyway, but it just depends on the platform and how resilient they are. So,
but I think that when you use them for monitoring, especially if there's a small cheap unit, you could really monitor the environment in a way that is magnitudes more exact and spread out than what we have today. Usually we have a few sensors telling us that at this point this is what's going on, but we don't know what's going on in the bigger picture.
That's true. You can get a much richer data from a swarm, so you can get data as a function of both space and time, dynamically changing data, and then you can also have your sensors adapt to where the interesting features are. So maybe they can detect a gradient or some maximum in a field, and they can kind of home in on that feature and get more detailed data about that feature.
Fish, for instance, is a huge resource for mankind that has to be managed and also has to be used wisely. Do you see swarms interacting with swarms of animals? Could we have swarms could we have every other fish be an artificial fish and simply lead them to the net? And we could determine that these fish are ready for harvesting and these fish should stay in the ocean and grow further. Could we interact with animals to better manage them?
There's definitely been work going on that kind of combines these artificial animals with real animals and investigates their interactions. It's also been done with cockroaches to influence, like the real cockroach, to aggregate in some area near a robot that may not look like a cockroach, but it has the pheromone scent of a cockroach.
Do you think that we're going to see swarms interacting with natural swarms anytime soon? Is that a emerging field, or is it?
It's hard for me to say how soon. I know there's definitely been work on it. For different animals, so including birds and fish and insects. So I think, and there's definitely interest from the community that studies these biological aggregations. So they're very interested in robotics from the point of view of, can they test out different plausible biological behaviors to see if that's what the animals are doing.
Yeah, so the robot helps us to when we can design a robot that does what the natural animal does, we know how they potentially could do it. We don't know that's actually how they do it, but that's at least one way, right?
Yeah, it's like it's a test bed because that you can vary lots of conditions, whereas a colony of ants might be more finicky the laboratory conditions. But another tool that robots provide for the biologists is a way to perturb the biological system and see how it reacts. So if you introduce a predator or like a nest mate that is actually artificial and you program it with certain behaviors, how does the real colony, the natural colony, react? And so you can kind of develop models of the animals' behaviors and interactions based on that. So I think as we develop these robotic tools for biologists and develop more sophisticated models of the biological swarms, then we can think more about controlling them so that they avoid aircraft or leading them like a Pied Piper away from insects infestations away from somebody's house. And so
instead of using chemicals and other things that's really bad in many ways, right?
Right.
And we could also use these swarms to take care of many things in agriculture. I would believe we can detect moisture levels in soil. Should we water? Should we not water? Do we need to use pest control in some way? Is this plant ready for harvesting? Or?
Right. Yeah. I know that robotics in agriculture is becoming really big now, and so you can. You can use drones and other vehicles for monitoring, the plants. And I know that I was on a postdoc position on a project called RoboBees, where they were developing robotic bees for things like crop pollination, and that was really as a supplement to. Natural bees, which were dying off in large numbers.
Yeah, we've seen that. It's a really disturbing trend.
So that was really to help supplement, for doing this really important pollination activity that produces so much of our food.
Yeah, but we're talking, dozens of % of what we eat every day.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very significant chunk. We don't want to lose it.
No.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very challenging problem. I mean, if you look at robotics in general, which could be said to be challenging enough.
Right.
Doing it with hundreds of thousands or millions of units, and this just adds, and the poor nano guys, they're doing it even harder. They really found a nut to crack there.
Right.
Yeah, that's just crazy stuff. But they can also achieve things that are just amazing, fighting cancer, monitoring the environment, and
definitely
fascinating. There's been so interesting to talk to you, and I'm sure we're going to do it again soon.
Yeah,
thank you very much for taking the time to do an interview.
Thank you for interviewing me.
This episode is sponsored by Aptomica. Everything you need in modular robotics. Or robots up close, what's going on in robotics, online and on the road. If you like this interview, don't forget to subscribe, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to our email newsletter on robotsindepth.com. You can also support the show on Patreon.